story is called Down by the Water's Edge by Bernadette Dyer. A long time ago, in the islands of the Caribbean, there lived two little sisters. One sister was very beautiful, but the other was plain as plain can be. The beautiful sister was not helpful or kind, and never did as she was told. It was always the plain sister who was kind, and helped with the housework from dawn to dusk. Now back in those days, there was no running water in the houses, so it was the children who were sent to fetch water from the rivers or wells. The plain sister did this quite often. She would take her bucket and cross the lush countryside, but the river was a fair distance from where she lived, and in order to get there she had to walk through many fields and meadows and small forests. Once she reached the river, there was a steep cliff with the sharp, jutting rocks along the edges and lush ferns growing out from the crevices. The plain sister would carefully climb down those treacherous rocks with her bucket, slip cautiously through the ferns, and make her way to the shore below. One day, as the plain sister was lowering herself carefully, she was surprised to see that there, sitting amongst the rocks and ferns, was the ugliest old woman it was possible to imagine. The old woman was covered with lumps and bumps, and on her back was a huge hump, and her face was covered in warts. The plain sister was frightened, but she did not show her fear. She continued to climb down, clutching the bucket. All of a sudden, the old woman turned and saw her. "Little girl," she said, "could you please scratch my back?" Now the plain sister was very frightened, but, since she always did as she was told, she went to the old woman, and she scratched her back. She scratched the old woman's back, and she scratched the old woman's back, and she scratched the old woman's back. But still, the old woman asked for it to be scratched some more. Her back was hard and brittle as broken glass. Soon as the girl scratched, her fingers ached and ran with blood. But still the old woman asked for more, so she scratched the old woman's back, until finally the old woman said, "Little girl, could you please get me a drink of water?" The plain sister was still frightened, but she didn't show her fear, and since she always did as she was told, she made her way down to the water's edge. She dipped her bucket into the water. Then, finding an old empty calabash nearby, she poured the water into the calabash. Finally, she climbed up the steep incline to where the old woman was, and gave her the water. The old woman drank thirstily. Then she spoke. "Little girl, you have been kind to an old woman. What can I give you in return?" The plain sister felt suddenly shy, and replied, "Your blessing is all I ask." The old woman smiled. "Little girl," she said, "go down to the river and get your water, and you will see what you will see." The plain sister climbed carefully through the rocks and ferns to the water's edge. She lowered her bucket into the water, but when she tried to pull it out, the bucket felt heavier than usual. She tugged at it with all her might, and finally she pulled it out. To her amazement, she could see that the bucket was heaping with diamonds and precious stones. She peered into the water and saw, looking back at her, a most beautiful little girl. When she moved her head, the little girl moved her head also. She moved her arm, and the little girl in the water moved her arm. It took the plain sister only a moment to realize that she and the little girl in the water were one and the same. And suddenly it occurred to her what must have happened. But when she turned to thank the old woman, she found her gone. Once again the girl climbed up the steep rock face, this time carrying her bucket of jewels. She walked through the forest and fields and meadows until she came to her village. As she drew near her home, her unkind sister saw her coming. The unkind sister could hardly believe that the lovely young girl with the bucket could be her plain sister. And she was even more amazed when she saw the jewels. "What happened to you?" she gasped. "Something happened down by the river," the girl replied. Before she could finish her story, however, the unkind sister grabbed a bucket of her own and raced off through the fields and meadows and forests toward the river. When she came to the place with the steep cliff, she slid through the ferns, barely managing to escape the sharp rocks. And then, just ahead of her, she saw sitting amongst the rocks the ugliest old woman it was possible to imagine. The old woman was covered with lumps and bumps, and on her back was a huge hump, and her face was covered in warts. Although she was somewhat surprised to see an old woman there, the unkind sister hurried on her way, more determined than ever to get to the water's edge. She was taken aback when the old woman called out to her, "Little girl, could you scratch my back, please?" Ignoring the old woman, the unkind sister pressed on, calling back sharply, "Scratch your own back. Can't you see that I'm in a hurry?" With that, she continued her descent. The old woman called out again, "Little girl, could you get me a drink of water?" The unkind sister was angry now, and paused before replying to the old woman. "Didn't you hear me the first time?" she sneered. "I have no time to do things for you. I have much more important things to do." And so saying, she scampered through the rocks until she stood by the water's edge. Immediately she lowered her bucket into the swirly waters. The bucket felt heavier than she expected, so she tugged and tugged at it with all her might. At last the bucket came up. It was heaping with frogs, toads, snails, and worms, and all the slimy, creeping things from the riverbed. Then, there in the water, she saw a great big claw moving. She moved her arm, and the claw moved. She moved her foot, and another great big claw in the water moved. She moved her head, and saw tiny black eyes on a huge head looking back at her. It took her only a moment to realize that she was seeing a giant crab, and that she and the crab were one and the same. And from that day until this, the unkind sister is living as a crab down in the mud at the water's edge, and no one will scratch her back. That was Down by the Water's Edge by Bernadette Dyer.